Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell. Across the internet from me is our customary co-host, useful human, Vikings blogger extraordinaire, and now reader of draft guides, every draft guide, it seems like, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. I'm absorbing all of the knowledge that comes with reading Nolan Naraki's almost but not quite racist takes on players.
Whoa. That's
just a joke from his Geno Smith and Cam Newton takes. Also, there's no way he listens to the show, so it's okay.
Well, should we send him like a physical copy of this episode? Will that be like a come to Jesus moment for him?
No, he's too busy talking to insiders about the way draft prospects smile. It's fine.
Oh, well, good. Then we don't need him. You know, we're actually not about insiders. We much prefer football outsiders, like guests we've had in the past. But I got to tell you, we've got a corker of a guest this week, and this one's actually in America. But I teased earlier that the host of the best fantasy football podcast on the internet was going to join us this week. And here he is, none other than the king of Rotoviz himself, Jon Moore. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. That's a very kind introduction, and I thank you guys for the invite. It's fun to be on. It's always great to kind of flip the role around from host to guest and share some thoughts that I don't normally get to. So thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, if you've got anything that you wanted to, because, you know, we'll like guide the show by asking questions and stuff. If you've got anything that you want to add that you feel is like relevant to maybe Vikings fans in particular, be sure to just interject that either at the beginning or whenever it seems relevant or as the show's winding down, just so you can get some of those thoughts off your chest, because I'm sure we want to hear them and we haven't necessarily anticipated sort of everything that you might want to add to the conversation. So feel free to just like guide the conversation as well.
Well, and I can promise that none of the listeners to the Rotoviz podcast have heard any of its thoughts about the Vikings, because despite doing half your show this week about wide receivers and teams that need them, the Vikings somehow went completely unmentioned.
Okay. So to be clear, the Vikings and the Cowboys were the fifth team that we were trying to decide between which we were going to talk about. And I got trumped by my co-host because he was like, well, the Vikings don't throw it as much. Cowboys, they might be a little bit sexier. Let's talk about them. So I'm actually really glad, because I had done the research to be prepared to talk about the Vikings that day, but I didn't get to actually talk about the Vikings that day.
Well, I'm glad we can help you.
A lot of teams must really need wide receivers, so the Vikings were like tied for fifth.
Well, the story on the show yesterday, for those who haven't listened, was mostly Josh Brown, right? Like all of a sudden the Browns need, or not Josh Brown, but the Browns in particular need
Josh Gordon.
Yeah, Josh Gordon.
Right.
And him no longer being a factor in Cleveland, creating a significant need for that position.
Vacuum, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Which it turns out they will optimally not fill until much later. But anyway, go listen to the Rotoviz Rotogrinders podcast. It's really great. But we've got Jon for a good 40 minutes before we pick his brain about research he has already done. I want to take a moment to tip our cap to our listeners. Thank you so much. We asked last week for a spike in donations so that we could get Arif some draft guides, which he is now reading. We found the dollars thanks to your kind contributions, and now you shall be rewarded with even better content, both written and spoken, because believe it or not, I've been reading the draft guides too, and there's a shocking amount of information in there. It must take a whole team of people to parse this stuff. Luckily, we've only got Arif.
That's great. Fantastic.
Hey,
I'll do my best to be an aggregate extraordinaire and BuzzFeed out some articles about what the consensus has to say. But until then, we'll talk to people who do what do we want to call it? Primary source work.
Yes.
Like Jon here.
Before we do that, I do just want to mention that if you would like to join the illustrious list of recurring Patreon subscribers, you can do so at patreon.com/Norse Code. We have one new subscriber this week, a personal friend of yours, Arif, right?
Oh yeah. Peter Jacobson, knew him in high school. Was actually my best friend in high school. So knew him in high school is maybe like a little bit underselling it. Thanks so much for donating to the podcast, Peter. Really appreciate it. We should get lunch sometime. All right, cool.
So if you would like to join the ranks of such illustrious humans as Arif's high school best friend, patreon.com/Norse Code. Also, paypal.me/Norse Code if you want to make a one-time contribution of any amount. The draft guides are not cheap, they're by and large not expensive, but they're also not free. So every dollar you contribute is more money that we can spend on awesome stuff like that. Now then, on with the show.
Yeah, we've got noted, let's say, ageist Jon Moore on the show. He's done a lot of work when it comes to evaluating, for the purposes of dynasty fantasy, evaluating skill positions, wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, and in particular has done a lot of work, it seems like, on wide receivers. Some of his ageism has been misinterpreted, so I'm sure he'll enjoy this opportunity to clarify a lot of that. But also, he probably just has thoughts on wide receivers in general, aside from the literal age that they are. And that's definitely a big interest of Vikings fans. Also, some of the other takes that he'll have will probably be a big interest of Vikings fans. So welcome to the show, Jon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if I may, for just a moment, you mentioned Patreon there. And as someone who has experience with that platform and someone who puts a lot of time into creating podcasts, it takes more time and energy than Arif or Dusty will ever let on. So if you find some value in the show, please support them. And then to your point about draft guides, there was a funny encounter this morning on Twitter that I just want to mention before we move along. So this person, Josh Hermsmeyer, tweeted at me and Fantasy Douche, who's also involved with Rotoviz.
Fantasy Douche.
Yeah, he said Rotoviz and Nolan Naraki agree on the order of the top 7 running backs. It's time to set fire to my computer.
What?
Yeah, to which Fantasy Douche replied, I'm actually more upset that our readership overlaps.
That's fantastic. And I can see why Fantasy Douche would think that. So we've got we had a film grinder on the other show, Matt Harmon, who actually turns his film into like actionable statistics, so maybe it's not quite the same thing to say, but we can go from notable film grinders and someone who has respectfully disagreed with Rotoviz a lot, Sigmund Bloom, to someone who represents, I think they've got a sarcastic box score scout app, sarcastically named, but actually a very useful app, as well as a lot of interesting statistics they produce about the way that college production, college statistics, and wide receiver measurables may turn out in terms of predicting future outcomes for receivers. And I think Jon Moore has been sort of maybe the head of spearheading a lot of really useful data and information about a lot of these wide receivers, not all of which is completely blind to stuff that happens on the field. So give us a little introduction to a lot of the work that you do. And I keep on mentioning wide receivers. You do other stuff too, but it's just so interesting for Vikings fans to talk about receivers that I just keep on wanting to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied finance in school. I had a minor in decision sciences and statistics. And so I'm a very analytical worldview person, particularly as it applies to football. I think right around the time, let's say maybe 2010, 2011, I feel like that Julio Jones, AJ Green class was the first one that I really started getting in to the draft community. And as you mentioned, people like Matt Waldman, for example, he's someone who in the early days I bought his draft guide. There's a gentleman named R.C. Fisher who does some great work. And in reading these people's work, I think one of the things that really inspired me was I want inside the black box. They publish these outcomes, but I wanted to learn more about the process, and I wanted to have access to the data myself for my own exploration. And so from that sort of stemmed this project that, takes up little chunks of 2-3 hours here and there year round of updating, exploring new metrics, particularly at the 3 positions that you mentioned, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. But I've explored with IDP metrics, defensive players. Quarterback continues to be something that I want to, I don't think I'll ever crack it, but I want to have better answers than the ones I do right now. And so,
that one's pretty difficult to nail down.
It's just kind of a labor of love and a side project that I do that has taken me to some fun places and got to meet some great people. And so, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And hopefully that's a helpful background on me just so that you all understand kind of my paradigm that I'm looking at the football world through.
Well, so I got a question for you. Mm-hmm. Why do you hate old, new wide receivers?
Yeah, here's kind of, I think, where that stemmed from. If you go back, I want to say it was the 2013 NFL draft was really when that started to tip, and a lot of digging went on. And really, that was the first spring that Rotoviz was around. I think February of 2013 was my first article I posted there. And so just a lot of things happen at once once you put a lot of people who are doing these kinds of things individually onto the same site. And Fantasy Douche would post something and I would read it, and that would inspire me to write this other thing. And then Sean Siegel would read something that I wrote, and then Matt Friedman would read something that, you know what I mean? And we just kind of like really pushed each other to keep exploring and finding new answers that other people hadn't discussed yet. And one thing that came out that was really interesting that year was the debate really around Cordero Patterson, DeAndre Hopkins, and Tavon Austin. And one thing that always kind of caught my eye about DeAndre Hopkins, as I mentioned, I'm very analytical, but I didn't think that people had appropriately accounted for age, which I know is something that's a big deal in basketball, is a big deal in baseball, but hadn't really made its way into the football world yet. And so the particular article that really got me scratching my head is Terrence Williams. It was about him, the wide receiver for the Cowboys, and he played his final college season at age 23.3. And by comparison...
And you measure age from December 31st of their final college season?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
And so... by comparison, DeAndre Hopkins played his final college season at 20.6. So he's almost 3 years younger. And I got to thinking about this, and how can that not matter? For example, I know in baseball, if you're 23 years old and you're in AAA, that's probably okay. If you're 20 and you're in AAA, that means that you're a star on the rise. And so I thought, why isn't this the same in football? And so a lot of my answers, or a lot of things that I've written since then, have been essentially about this question of if physiologically, like, male athletes peak at, let's say, 27, 28 years old, why wouldn't we discount someone who is closer to that physical maturation, like Terrence Williams in this example, and give credit to younger players like DeAndre Hopkins in this example? And so basically, the thing that I ultimately came up with is this notion of age adjusting for production, and trying to say not that all old players are bad, but rather that expectations for older players should be different than younger players, and creating a sort of sliding scale so we can view these players on an equal playing field, if you will.
Yeah, no, I always find it interesting that, especially because we deal with this a lot in football, lessons from other sports where people may be more analytically inclined or more willing to maybe question the orthodoxy. Really, they take their time to make its way over to football. And I know this happens a lot, not just in baseball, but also basketball as well, where if something is true in one sport and it's true in another sport, then maybe the presumption should be, that it's true in a third sport, and that we should probably actively try to disprove that presumption more than try to have to prove it as much. But you've done a lot of legwork in terms of providing not just the data, but visually, like visualizing sort of that data in terms of, what it means for the NFL. And of course, you've done it for receivers. I know a lot of people take into account for quarterbacks. Benjamin Albright, for example, refuses to put anybody on his draft board, his sort of, maybe not imaginary, but, hypothetical draft board if a quarterback is like over 24, that sort of stuff. And it's not something that, as a community, football had been dealing that much with. This year, however, a lot of people are talking about it. And some of that, I'm sure, has to do with you, but some of it is just, does it seem like people are talking about age more with football players in this draft class than they have been in previous draft class?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I think even if you just pay attention to the different blurbs and things that are out there, Roto World, for example, I know had something about Devonta Booker being, I think, 24 years old as a rookie, and things like that. And honestly, as someone who really, I didn't play football. I was always pretty small. I played golf. I was pretty good at that. I've always loved football, though. I mean, growing up in Ohio, it's sort of expected. But I didn't have there was no reason anyone on planet Earth should have paid attention to anything I had to say about football. And so my whole approach to this was, what niche can I exploit to the extent that I become known for that thing, and to the extent that it becomes sort of an undeniable factor that is true. And so basically from 2013 on, I said that every article I was going to write moving forward, if it was about a prospect, would include their age, because age has to matter. And from the back testing that I've done to statistically project player stats over their first 2, 3, 4 seasons in the NFL, age consistently stays in there, even after you add in draft position. And the reason that I bring this up is because there are lots of things that if you make a model to project that does not include draft position, those things go away when draft position goes in, which is essentially saying the NFL is accounting for those things with the selection that they make about them. But what's interesting about age is that age stays in even when draft position goes in, the implication being that the NFL does not appropriately value age, and therefore it's an opportunity to be exploited in finding players who are
to generate some additional market or generate additional efficiency, exploiting market inefficiency. It kind of depends on the way you look at it. That's actually interesting. I was actually arguing with someone about this, and they were less than impressed with the representation of data in one of your articles, and it seems that a lot of people don't seem to understand that last fact, that though the NFL seems to account for age in some respect, they don't account for it enough, or they don't do it in the appropriate manner. Do you think NFL teams are doing it more and more now? Do you see like the impact of age as a variable maybe diminishing a little bit over the past couple of years?
I think just anytime something becomes more part of the conversation, it'll probably be increasingly accounted for. But I think, for example, I spend a decent enough time with people, for example, like Dane Brugler, who was on the show last night, Matt Waldman, who was on Rotoviz Radio, I think 2 weeks ago, and even Matt Harmon. I ask him, what role does age play in your evaluation? And by and large, it's, well, unless they're 27 years old, I don't really know what the difference is. And for me, the thing that I always say about this is that age, it shouldn't be taken into account as it pertains to career shelf life, because that is a very short and precious thing in the NFL. What we're really applying age to figure out is how good is the talent that we're actually seeing. For example, if we put a 23-year-old Josh Doxson in that TCU offense, he does what he did in 2015 and has an absolutely spectacular year. But think about this. If in 3 years you put 23-year-old Laquon Treadwell in the 2015 TCU offense, don't you think that Treadwell probably does everything that Doxson does, if not more? And so, therefore, the credit kind of shifts more towards Treadwell. I hope that makes some sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think another way to put it is if a player is doing well when the average age of their opponent is 19, right? They should be expected to do better when they're 21, 22, and that's fine. But I think the second half of that is that advantage will disappear when they enter the NFL. They will no longer have the advantages that were generated by both their experience and athletic development as a player when they enter the NFL. And so their ability to use those advantages will diminish, the older they are when they enter the NFL. And so the standard that you have to hold those players to in terms of the way that they perform against, those 19, 20-year-olds should be higher. And that makes perfect sense. And I think that, and if this is a 2015 article you wrote, it's that there are older wide receivers who have done well in the NFL, and it's exactly, if you hold them to that higher standard, they meet or exceed. And I think the two most famous examples are Marvin Harrison and Keyshawn Johnson. But sort of turning that into a more, sort of present discussion, how do you think that the Vikings' options at wide receiver, maybe sort of in the first 2 or 3 rounds, will depend on age, and how do you think age-adjusted production, which you represent in something called Phenom Index. How do you think age-adjusted production should factor into those evaluations?
Yeah, so looking at the Vikings passing game right now, the one thing that I really wanted to point out, and this is probably painfully obvious to you, but I noticed this when I was going through the most wide receiver needy teams, is that if you look over the last 2 seasons, the Vikings rank 30th in pass plays over 20 yards with 84. By comparison, the Bears have 13 more, the Lions have 22 more, and the Packers have 30 more. And I know that doesn't probably seem like a huge number, but if you think about it, over the last 2 seasons, the Packers have had one more 20-plus yard play each game than the Vikings do. Right. I think that absolutely has to matter. But I think part of that, and why I think I'd be excited if I was a Vikings fan, is that having played their games outdoors and shifting into the new stadium in 2016, I'm optimistic that they could see an uptick in their passing offense. And so particularly if we're looking at the potential of who the Vikings could pick in this upcoming draft, I mean, really, I tried to look at it based on their first 4 round picks. So, for example, 23, 54, 86, and 121 are where the Vikings draft in the first 4 rounds. After the first 4 rounds, picks become kind of questionable value versus like undrafted free agents, for example. And so if you look at the 23rd pick, I think the most interesting thing that comes through there is the potential that you've got 2 guys who are on the younger side, being Laquon Treadwell and Corey Coleman, could present as options. But then you also have 2 guys who are among the oldest receivers in this class, being Josh Doxson and Michael Thomas from Ohio State. Neither of those guys, in my view, was particularly good until their age 22 season in college. And
that's a breakout age, right? The concept you're talking about right now. Okay.
Yeah, the first time that they accounted for over 20% of their team's receiving yards. And basically, if you think about a personnel formation, there are 5 pass catching options on the field on every play. And so, 100% divided by 5, 20%. That's kind of where I come up with that notion of, when did they first truly emerge as one of the best 5 targets in their passing offense. I think if you're looking at the Vikings at 23, I think Corey Coleman offers a lot of intrigue. He's a guy who had a lot of explosive plays in college last year. If you look at the number of 20-plus yard plays that he had as a receiver, they came on about a third of his total catches. So he's a guy that continually got open deep and created big plays for his offense. I think he could be a good fit there. I think to the extent that Treadwell is someone who is sort of known for more physical play, being a good blocker, being able to work efficiently underneath and in sort of crowded areas, I think that could make sense for a Vikings passing offense that maybe isn't going to be as prone to going deep. But I think of those 2 options, Coleman would be the preferable one if he were there at 23. That's not to say that Doxson and Michael Thomas aren't good NFL receivers. I like both of those guys plenty. But I think as far as if we're talking about this through my worldview, which is age and production, those are 2 guys that I think I would be a little less excited about, just because I think there's more potential that they are closer to their ceiling already than the other 2 that I mentioned.
Okay, and then I think one quick question about those 4 before we move on, I think to a running back discussion that I think could be interesting. We talk about age-adjusted production a lot, and for a lot of that discussion, we talk about older players meeting or exceeding their age-adjusted production. But sometimes, we want to talk about one of these younger players, and I think what's interesting is that Laquon Treadwell, his age-adjusted production still isn't amazing or anything like that. In terms of market share versus the expected age versus market share. Does that bother you a little bit, or do you think that you get a wider variance on what are acceptable outcomes for younger players entering the draft than for older players?
It bothers me a bit. I think what ultimately helps sort of soothe the Treadwell concerns in my mind is the stretch that he went on this year. If you could look past his first 3 games, and let's just say that you give him the benefit of the doubt for being on the mend from his season-ending injury in 2014, you say, all right, let's look at just the last 9-10 games of this season and what he did. And he looks a little bit better in terms of market share than if you look at his whole season numbers. He had a number of 100-yard touchdown kinds of games against SEC opponents, which is always an encouraging thing. I mean, I think here's the thing about Treadwell is I think of him in a similar vein to perhaps a Hakeem Nicks or a DeAndre Hopkins, in that I think if people were saying Treadwell should go, 20th, 25th overall, great. I think when people say Treadwell should go 5th overall, 6th overall, I think that makes me a little bit nervous. And so that's why within this conversation, if you look at him as someone for the Vikings at 23, I'm much more comfortable with them paying that price for him than I would be otherwise.
Sure. And then let's talk quickly about running backs. It's not something a lot of people talk about with the Vikings. A lot of people love Derrick McKinnon. I love Derrick McKinnon. I think that he can be an every down back. But Adrian Peterson is kind of this open question hanging in the air. Do the Vikings want to switch to running back by committee when he's out while he's still here? At what age would Adrian Peterson's, production drop off? This is always sort of a difficult question. And then sort of if the Vikings want to be aggressive early in finding a running back in the mid to later rounds to pair with Derrick McKinnon or to take over for Adrian Peterson, sort of what should they do? So I think the first question in all of this is, at what point do you expect Adrian Peterson might be less than the running back that he's been made out to be in the context of the role he has for the Vikings offense?
I mean, here's the thing that I always kind of come back to, because I'm again more analytical when I look at these things. If you look at Peterson's efficiency as both a receiver and a runner, it is still well above average. And so I think as far as having a succession plan in place, that obviously is always a great idea. If you look at McKinnon has been spectacular too. So for example, the Vikings last year, if you look at what Stephon Diggs did, McKinnon was almost that caliber of a receiver in terms of fantasy efficiency with his targets. And so he's a guy that I think really can do it all. I think it's great that they have him in place as someone that could step in. But I don't know if I would quite be ready to give up on Peterson yet. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on how close he is to the end of his road?
For me, it seems like he'll be much better than a serviceable back this year. But from my understanding and the research that I've done, that I've had other people do, is that running back aging isn't a slow decline, it's a cliff. And so we don't know when that cliff is going to be. Adrian Peterson is unique, I think, anecdotally. I think he's unique statistically. It's going to be very difficult to figure out more for him than any other running back when that cliff is going to be. But for a team that has been centered around a running game for so long and that has relied on the insurance provided by that kind of running game, it's better to have insurance for that insurance, basically, sooner rather than later. And then, of course, there's the whole salary cap issue. He's taking up a lot of cap now, but next year is going to take up $18 million of the cap. You have to balance that versus how much he can contribute as a running back versus how much the running game actually matters versus whether or not he's going to fall off a cliff sooner than later. I mean, there's a lot of factors involved. But to me, I think, obviously, the brain has to make approximations. I'm not doing all the math in a spreadsheet or anything. But to me, I think approximately speaking, you want to make the investment sooner rather than later in terms of trying to find a replacement or trying to find a solution. Maybe not a replacement, maybe a solution as a running back by committee or more emphasis on the screen game or something, right?
Yeah.
But because running backs tend to have cliffs instead of slow declines, it worries me that we don't really know when that's going to be for Peterson, especially because he's had such a unique career path, with an injury, killing about a season's worth of carries, and then actually the injury didn't do that much in terms of carries, but then also the off-field injury the off-field incident in terms of keeping him off the field. A bunch of stuff. It's just so many factors, but I think that the more factors you have, the more likelihood that there's a chance for failure. It's very like black swan kind of thought process there. And so the Vikings should, at some point, sooner rather than later. I think Peterson will be above average this year, but I think that people might be overselling what he's going to do.
Yeah, so if I could offer a potential solution for them, one player that I really liked, and I was actually the highest of the Rotoviz rankers, we recently came out with our composite draft rankings where everyone on staff, grades their players, and then we average it out and see where guys fall. Jonathan Williams from Arkansas is a guy that I was higher on.
Fantastic. I love Jonathan Williams.
Yeah, higher on than anybody else in the draft, on the staff. And for me, he's a guy, in case anyone doesn't know, he missed the entire 2015 season with a foot injury. He was one of the most productive runners in the country, really, between the 2013 and 14 seasons. I wrote an article about him basically saying Jonathan Williams is the forgotten man. If you look at where all these guys fell, essentially on their 21st birthday, because Jonathan Williams' college career essentially ended on his 21st birthday. If you look at where all these guys fell on their 21st birthday, Jonathan Williams, I think, was like the 4th or 5th most productive back in the class at that point. And then you look at him and you think, okay, he's 220 pounds. He had, I think, a 1.57 10-yard split on his 40-yard dash, which is incredible for someone that big. He has a 3-cone time under 7 seconds, which is really agile for someone that big and is someone that something that I really care about. And so if you look for a guy who might need to spend some time in an NFL program, get healthy, not have to be counted on right away, but maybe that you could get in the 3rd or 4th round and could absolutely be a feature back, Jonathan Williams, I'd be interested in that capacity. And then if you're going to throw sort of upside darts, if you will, at guys who could be feature backs, maybe McKinnon's complementary workload, I'm really intrigued by Peyton Barber out of Auburn. I was, I think, the highest on him out of anybody on staff. And he's a guy that, again, doesn't necessarily have the maybe the explosiveness that you'd like to see, but he's real big, real agile, and was a good, productive player this last year at Auburn. I think he could be a value a little bit later. I don't know how late someone like that could really go, because I think he could be worth it in the 4th round, or I could see him going in the 6th. But just another name to throw out there.
Cool. Well, we are really close to having to let you go. I know Dusty has queued up some mailbag questions for you, but one real quick question I wanted to ask before that. You mentioned Jonathan Williams. I think it was you or someone else at Rotoviz wrote an article about how to evaluate when 2 running back prospects are considered draftable and they're coming out of the same draft class, and how to evaluate them from a production perspective when you have those 2. Could you talk about that real briefly before Dusty queues up a question or 2?
Yeah, basically the conclusion that I came to, I looked at running backs from the same school who were drafted in the same year. So, for example, this year we have Derrick Henry and Kenyan Drake out of Alabama. We've got Alex Collins and Jonathan Williams out of Arkansas. And what I was trying to figure out is how do I know when one of these guys is actually going to be good, or when is it okay to make the excuse that he was blocked by his teammate and let's just forgive his underwhelming production? And basically the conclusion that I came to is that if you look at guys who end up being successful in the NFL, usually in their own right, they're pretty productive. So, for example, like Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins this year both averaged, let's say, maybe like 75 to 85 rushing yards per game for their career. Really good production. Kenyan Drake,
teams with 2 draftable running backs just happen to run more often and allow their backs to be more productive.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. And then by comparison, Kenyan Drake for his career averaged something like 30 rushing yards per game.
Right.
And so something like that makes me much more nervous. But I will say that I think in instances where both backs are NFL caliber backs, think Ronnie Brown and Carnell Williams, think Peyton Barber, or not, Peyton Hillis and Felix Jones and Darren McFadden.
Right.
Those tend to be really high upside backs if they're able to come from a system that produces 2 high quality NFL runners. It's almost like if one of them disappeared, maybe that other guy would have been like a super elite prospect. And so, yeah, I'm feeling much more confident about the Williams-Collins duo being successful than the Henry-Kenyan Drake one being successful. I think Henry's an outstanding unicorn level prospect, but I'm a little bit worried about Drake ever being anything more than sort of a rotational guy, kick returner, that sort of thing.
And then, Dusty, do you have any questions you want to fire off before we have to let him go?
Absolutely. Luckily, you guys managed to cover most of our readers' questions in line, but the conventional wisdom at the start of kind of the off season was that Josh Doxson was kind of a lock for 23. And a lot of people in kind of the Vikings community talked about his freakish athleticism and his ability to make a contested catch, and kind of held those up as attributes that would make him ideal. Now, you posted your annual Phenom Index for rookie wide receivers, and you can find that on rotoviz.com, which is actually really worth the $3 subscription just to listen to this. And so the Phenom Index, I mean, I don't want to just read the article, but Laquon Treadwell, Corey Coleman, Michael Thomas from Southern Methodist, not Ohio State Michael Thomas, are all pretty high up on the list, but not as high, or they do not have as high Phenom scores as the average or the top 12 NFL receivers in 2015. Homeboy is way further down that list. Like Dotson he's what, like 60th, 70th or something. Why are you so unimpressed by his athleticism when most of our community has been high on him this whole time?
I mean, honestly, my belief is that athleticism almost goes away once draft position comes into play. And so really what you need to pay attention to are age and production, whether that's market share, whether that is yards per game, something like that. And so ultimately for Dotson, he's a guy that he's going to get plenty of opportunities because he's going to be drafted so highly. But I just get nervous when I look at him and think, if this guy is so good, why did it take him until being a 22-year-old to finally matter in the college landscape? I mean, if you think about, let's say, like Amari Cooper or Sammy Watkins, those are guys that as 18-year-olds in college, they were really good. So essentially, Josh Dotson is almost 4 years developmentally behind those players. And so just to be clear, like I think Josh Dotson is a good player. I think that he will have a good career. I think he's going to get drafted highly. I mean, I think ultimately because of how high his draft position is going to be, he's probably going to be in my top 5 receivers post-draft. But just going into it, he makes me a little bit nervous as far as being close to his potential already and not having much to go once he gets into the NFL.
Okay, well, if the Vikings end up foregoing this first-round receiver idea, maybe they want to add another body to the offensive line, maybe they get a linebacker or a safety, and they miss out on those 4 receivers, who are guys sort of in the rounds, in the following round. So day 2 receivers, basically, that you could be really excited about for the Vikings. And I think a lot of readers who are familiar with your work know that you'll bring up Leonte Carroo, so talk about him a little bit, but also maybe some of the other receivers that'd be good.
Sure. I think looking at someone who could really open up the top with coming off the play action, I think Will Fuller, he's a guy that has had a great career. In a lot of ways, I think he's maybe a superior prospect to Philip Dorsett, who we saw go in the top of the first round, the bottom of the first round last year. Will Fuller is one of the best big play receivers in the country. I think if you look at Leonte Carroo, he's a guy that metrically checks almost every single box that you could ask a guy to check. Last year, he accounted for 43% of his team's receiving yards, which is one of the best. It's the best rank of any Power 5 conference receiver. And if you look at his efficiency, this is something that I've been getting more into, is efficiency. Leonte Carroo averaged 14.7 yards per target. That's not per catch.
Wow.
That's per target. And by comparison, if you look at the receivers drafted in the first 4 rounds, going back to, say, 2010, I think those guys usually average about 9.8 yards. So basically, Carroo, compared to the average top 4-round receiver, this last season got 5 more yards per target, which is insane. If you, just by comparison, Will Fuller was really high up there too. He averaged 13.1 yards per target. So he's a tremendously efficient option. And then you mentioned Mike Thomas from Southern Miss earlier. He's a guy that I think potentially at 86 or even 121, it's really hard to get a feel for where Mike Thomas might get drafted. Southern Miss one because he wasn't invited to the combine, which is a really big deal.
Combine invites give us a lot of information about potential draft position.
They absolutely do. So, 86, maybe 121, maybe even later than that. I think Southern Miss Mike Thomas is an interesting name. And then I guess I'll just throw out a couple more that I've written about that I think are probably 4th round, 5th round guys. Kiaris Garrett from Tulsa and Chris Moore from Cincinnati. I have a new article about him that just went up today. I think a lot of people are looking at a guy named Sharon Peak from Clemson and saying, oh, Sharon Peak could be, the next Martavis Bryant. I wrote an article today that basically said Chris Moore looks a heck of a lot more like Martavis Bryant than Sharon Peak does, but nobody's talking about Chris Moore right now. So I think he's an interesting name too. Field stretcher, tremendously efficient. I want to say over his last 2 seasons combined, he averaged something like 12 yards per target. So really a highly efficient guy. And I know I was kind of going faster with some of the numbers, but feel free to hit me up on Twitter at the CFX if you want to talk more about this. I'm always glad to kind of jump into the fray with people, and really glad to jump on with you guys.
Fantastic! Thanks for coming on the show.
A genuine pleasure. Jon Moore is the host of Rotoviz Radio, the best fantasy football podcast on the internet, for my dollar. And if you want to give them $3 to subscribe to the Rotoviz website content, then I strongly recommend you do that if you've got $3 in your pocket, because Jon is an amazing writer as well. You can find all of his stuff at rotoviz.com. You can find him on Twitter at the CFX. Is there anything you would like to plug before we let you go?
Yes, I know some people were asking, am I related to DMX? And my answer to that is, no, I'm not related to DMX. But I just wanted to bark on air because I've never done that on the Rotoviz pod before.
Oh, I'm glad we could give you an opportunity to do that.
All right, guys. Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon.
All right.
Wow. Well, Jon Moore is not DMX. That is what I gathered from that conversation.
Regrettable, but still a fine human being.
So I guess I want to ask you this question too. I took a very long-winded and roundabout sort of way to kind of promote the Rotoviz article and the concept of the Phenom Index, which I guess is kind of designed to show who might be like a true phenom and not just who's going to be good and who's going to be not so good. But the eponymous question asker, I guess he's trying to work his way up to official question asker, but isn't quite there yet. At Jesse Silva on Twitter asks us, what do you do when a prospect has good tape but not good production?
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I know there's something up to keep this a Rotoviz-ish show. There's something up on Rotoviz that is basically a conglomerate of I guess tape watchers in terms of trying to predict draft position. And I think that what ends up happening a lot is that when we talk about, why all these metrics matter, a lot of times we do it in the context relative to draft position, which means that whatever determines draft position is actually prior. It sets our expectations, then we move around that. And most of the time what sets our draft position is our perception of their tape or our perception of how the NFL thinks about their tape. So in terms of evaluating technique and skill and sustainability in terms of what they can do on film, as it were, the first thing that tape does is it sets draft position. And then I think that, and so it's prior, it always comes first really for a lot of guys, even guys that don't really like the subjectivity of it. Like we've had Davis Maddock on the show before, and he's been sort of vocal in how people tend to over-rely on the concept of more subjective understandings of analysis like tape. But even then, even knowing that you can be a very vocal critic of it, we know that it sets the board much more than production does. Good tape tends to lead to good production, so it's not like that's unusual. So what usually happens when we hit that case of good tape, bad production, kind of like Laquon Treadwell, not quite, but kind of. Or kind of like Michael Thomas, is that we need to determine how much tape has contributed to the draft grade, which that's always obviously very difficult, and what are approximate causes for the low production. So for me, and this is something that if we had a little bit more time with Jon, I probably would have asked him about, in terms of adjusting for teammates. So, I think college market share it's a remarkable tool. It's immensely productive. And we know that there's a couple of misses. And I know we got a question about, where market share of yards has missed before. And some of the biggest misses are players like AJ Green, they're players like Odell Beckham or Jarvis Landry. And a lot of those times...
Just to be clear, for those who may not be familiar with the term, market share means the percentage of targets...
or percentage of yards.
Percentage of yards divided between the receiving core on any given team.
Right, and so what you can do to get approximate market share is take the receiving yards, divide by the team's passing yards, and you've got a good market share of yards. And generally speaking, if you've got a draftable receiver, they'll have a great market share of yards. If you've got a very good receiver, they'll have a fantastic market share of yards. And receivers that tend to do well in the NFL tend to consume more than their age expectation of yards. So for receivers that are 20-some years old, in their 20-year-old year, they tend to consume about 23% or something like that. And we've got there. I'll throw the chart up on the show notes so you can take a better look at what your age-adjusted production should look like. But they tend to consume 23% of the yards. But by the time you're 24, you need to consume something like 41% of your team's receiving yardage. And it's weird because what if you have talented teammates? This doesn't account for the way that teams tend to cover you. This doesn't account for a lot of things, but it actually tends to account for a lot more than people think, and it's much better than raw receiving yardage in terms of evaluating college production. If you're not a draftable receiver, it is unlikely that the talent difference between you and someone else on your team is so big that you consume more than 20% of your yards. The opposite tends to be true if you're a draftable receiver. But the problem with AJ Green is that he was in the same draft class as Chris Durham, who went in the 4th round. Jarvis Landry was in the same class as Odell Beckham and vice versa. And all the Clemson receivers had to compete with each other: Sammy Watkins, DeAndre Hopkins, Martavis Bryant, etc. And if there are multiple drafted receivers, you have to take that into account. So maybe that's one reason production is down. And I think for Laquon Treadwell, that's a minor reason. You've got Evan Ingram, you've got Cody Core. Some people consider that running back to be draftable. And then next year, some people think Quincy Adebayo, or however you pronounce his last name, is draftable. He certainly has a body that NFL evaluators will like. You have to take that into account. You have to take into account injury. I think Jon Moore actually talked about that, because we brought up Treadwell's, maybe questionable-ish production even after accounting for age in the first 3 games of the season. And I think the 3rd game was Alabama. Treadwell's production wasn't as great as the last 9 games of the season, starting with Vanderbilt and Florida. And so that's another reason. If they're injured, that's a reason. Sometimes we find out about injuries afterwards. I know that, a couple of players in the draft have been playing with a sports hernia all year. One player's playing with a torn, labrum all year, that sort of stuff. That's a question you have to ask. And sometimes you have to figure out, is this tape so good that this player looks like an outlier? Because, like we mentioned, even after you account for teammate, yardage, you'll have misses, right? Maybe 70%. Maybe that's a little high, but it could be that 70% of receivers who exceed the draft position expectation had better age-adjusted market share of yards than you would normally expect for a receiver their age. That's a really great hit rate. That's amazing. But it still means it's maybe one of the best you could possibly find when it comes to something as situational and moving partish as football. But you're still going to find a situation where 30% of receivers who exceeded their draft position had poor production. So you have to figure out, is this player so unique? Is their tape so good and so sustainable and so interesting that I can reliably say I think they're in this 30%? And then you have to make sure when you make that decision that you're not making that decision too many times. And if you end up making that decision too many times, you're going to end up having to, I think from a process perspective, see which player is the least likely of those to make it. So there's a lot of things you have to do when tape doesn't meet production, or vice versa, when production doesn't meet tape. And I think Will Fuller might be an example of that. And figure out sort of what you think that means for this prospect in particular, because aggregates are great, but individual prospects are individual prospects. And sometimes situations that you can predict will cause, those discrepancies, and sometimes situations that you cannot account for, cannot predict, will cause those discrepancies. And you have to figure out, what it is. Yeah, there's nothing necessarily wrong with going with your gut. I just think that when you do that, your gut should be a little bit more informed than it was if you just decided, screw the analytics.
Well, and it seems to me too, like talking a little bit more about when market share can, lead to a quote unquote miss. It is much more likely that it'll be, kind of the things that you were just talking about and that Jon was talking about, injury or, other issues. And not just that you were a wide receiver on a team with the best 5 wide receivers in college. And so you didn't get enough touches and the market share was like unfairly divided between you.
Right, and I've been doing work to even correct for teammate market share. So, and so even then, you still get, even after you correct for it, 30% of the people that you say will hit or whatever number it is will miss, and vice versa. It can't just be like, well, he was blocked by whoever. And what's interesting is that quarterback quality is often something that people bring up when it comes to, well, this receiver, I'm kind of concerned about the production. That actually matters a lot less based off of my look. Maybe Jon has a different opinion, but it seems like to matter a lot less. So I think, for example, one thing that people seem to assume is that if you have a poor quarterback, he'll make poor decisions, and those poor decisions mean, not throwing to this receiver that's obviously good. And that makes sense. Like, if you think about it sort of in a vacuum, like, oh, they make poor decisions, so they didn't get the distribution of yards they should have gotten. But really what tends to happen with bad quarterbacks is they tend to over-rely on your NFL draft-worthy receiver and under-rely on people who may be getting open, but the quarterback doesn't trust as much because they don't have the ability to evaluate defenses all that well. And so really a bad quarterback, generally speaking, in the aggregate, should over-target a receiver. And so that's actually not a very good explanation to me unless you describe, a quarterback's tendencies such that the way that receiver wins tends not to be the way that the quarterback tends to play. So, for example, if you've got a quarterback with a weak arm that likes to play short and in the middle of the field or on screen passes, and the receiver that you're looking at tends to win intermediate a lot because of their physicality and route running skills, that they over-target short passes, or they tend to over-target screens or something like that, then maybe that's a decent explanation. But you have to be careful not using these explanations too often.
But it makes like intuitive sense to me when I think of it now, using yards as opposed to targets as kind of a way to filter out bad quarterbacking from market share results. Like, he's not throwing the ball to somebody on somebody else's team. He's still got the same receivers, and given the tendency of a bad quarterback to rely on a really good receiver, a good receiver is going to find ways to get separation and get clear and maybe make unconventional plays that wouldn't have happened if he just had like a good quarterback that could perform consistently. The reality will end up still being that he has a larger market share. It's just that he got it a different way.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so you need to find another explanation than bad quarterback. I think what happens a lot is when you want to make these distinctions, or when you really want to pound the table for a guy that you think is just good, I think your reasonings should stand up to the data. So if you say, well, it's because they have a bad quarterback, it's not that I'm closed off from that reasoning, or it's not that we should be closed off from that reasoning. So you have to test whether or not receivers who have traditionally failed this market share test have had bad quarterbacks. So let's go back to AJ Green. Aaron Murray was his quarterback, right? This dude was definitely draftable. And not just that, he was a much better college player than he was a draft prospect. He was a fantastic college player. AJ Green's market share of yards should not have been negatively impacted by the fact, quote unquote, that Aaron Murray was his quarterback. And I think before that may have even been Mettenberger, which is actually also another explanation, that, hey, maybe Mettenberger isn't the reason that, Odell Beckham didn't get the market share of yards. Maybe it's because Jarvis Landry was like a second or third round quality quarterback or receiver. So you need to take a look at some of these misses and explain why they're misses, and hold them up to the reasoning that you're giving for why you want to hold this prospect up. That's actually a lot of the issue that I have, is that a lot of people will give reasons and they won't test these reasons against what should be readily available data. And this data is readily available. We have Phenom Index scores, which is basically market share plus age, or rather minus age, because more age is bad. We have Phenom Index scores that go, years back. I think back to like 2004, 2005. It's on the Rotoviz website. I've got, the Excel spreadsheet myself. And you could take a look at how many yards per season, these receivers produced, track it against market share and track it against Phenom Index, and figure out, which ones are the biggest misses, and then try to figure out why they're misses. If you just give a reason and you don't take any time or thought into did this reason impact the other misses, then it's not a useful argument,
Well, and I feel like we're getting to a point, increasingly so year after year. I think it was actually something you said about 2 minutes ago about expected age-adjusted production. I was just like, wow, that is so heavily derived. Like, you have to know what age-adjusted production is, and like you have to have some background with that in order to understand why it's so useful and why, simply, labeling somebody or coming up with an excuse that might not necessarily hold water as to, why you're pounding the table for this guy or against this guy is worthwhile.
Yeah, and, a lot of that has to do with the communication from, eggheads like me or stat heads like John to explain what we mean by production. Some of that does come down to that, and it does take a little bit of time to understand the process. But, on the other hand, if you give a reason and you don't know what the argument you're arguing against is, so age-adjusted production, expected age-adjusted production, they're terms that, they get longer and longer and more confusing. Then I think that, and, a lot of my followers will do this. A lot of my followers aren't even like that interested in statistics or data methodology. They'll ask, well, who are the biggest misses in your system? And I mean, that's just a sign of a good thinker, honestly, because it gives them an understanding of maybe not the data, but what your data can and cannot do. So, for example, when I was doing linebacker athleticism scores, some people were like, okay, well, who are the biggest misses? Is Luke Kuechly a miss? And it turns out he's not a miss. People just assume he's not athletic for reasons. But, people ask about Vontaze Burfict. Of course they would. He's a terrible athlete. They ask, does Vontaze Burfict look like, and another, does Vontaze Burfict look like other misses that happened? Is he an outlier? Is that a reason that we can trust Tyler Matakevich, who is a high tackle, low athleticism guy? Scooby Wright, high tackle, low athleticism guy. Vontaze Burfict is a high tackle, low athleticism guy. Pretty good player. Crazy. Pretty good player. Do these two players that fit his prototype, can we assume that his prototype is a prototype for a miss in your system? Who are the other misses, right? So those are good questions to ask, and I think that that's important. But also, it's difficult to communicate some of these concepts, right? Really, we should try to be, people like me should try to be a little bit more clear in a lot of these concepts. So when I say expected age-adjusted production, really all I'm trying to say is, given, how old they are, did they produce? People know both of those concepts intimately. And so if I say, they didn't meet their age-adjusted expected production, people are like, well, whatever. But if I say, for a 24-year-old, he didn't do much, people kind of understand that. And it's actually, people are much less likely to want to argue because people have this if they like a guy, right, they are much more likely to put their backs up against the wall against a concept that they think is further removed from the way football is played or the way that we should think about things than they are if you put things or couch things in terms that it's the exact same stuff, it's the exact same data and the exact same concept. But if you couch things in terms of, the way that people traditionally understand. So, why didn't he produce given that he was 23, right? Or, hey, he may not have produced very much, but he was 20, and, I think for 20-year-olds, he did a pretty good job. Then if you give, then if I'm giving that argument and someone argues against it and say, hey, his tape actually shows he's pretty good, I think the reason is this. And I'd be like, well, when I take a look at it through this filter, when I look at other 20-year-olds who didn't produce very much, these are the misses. And for them, that wasn't the reason that they missed. The quarterback wasn't the reason that they missed, or the conference or strength of opposition wasn't the reason that they missed. It was, it was this reason or this reason or this reason, or, hey, this guy's just an outlier. I have no idea. His tape was just really good, I guess.
Well, yeah, exactly. And then when you come at it with the kind of, I guess, layman's explanation, then it gives them the opportunity to ask, well, okay, so what creates a hit and a miss? It gives them, like you were saying, a chance for them to fit players they know and information they know into a frame that is maybe a little bit confusing. Or at least it seems that way if you aren't familiar with the definitions and you aren't familiar with how oftentimes this stuff is just, taking a relatively simple data set and applying another filter to it. And then another filter and another filter, like a bad Photoshop.
Right, like a bad photo, bitmaps.
Yeah, exactly. and that's fine, but I still think there is value to having, I think baseball does well by having, acronyms and kind of a set language or at least lexicon for this sort of thing, because it kind of lets you, once you have that base familiarity with what these terms mean and how we can put them together, then it saves time having to explain to someone who might already know what you mean.
Yeah, and what's nice about baseball is that, and there's a new statistic that I learn about basically every year for baseball. I think last year it was WOBA, which I've already forgotten. But what's nice about baseball is that there are multiple websites that not only have standardized definitions for things that are not wins above replacement. I guess that's not standardized. But they have standardized definitions for things, and they have glossaries.
Yeah, you can go straight to fangraphs.com, and they are. I mean, there'll always be people that argue in any community, but they are basically the arbiter of baseball-derived stats and acronyms. And
right.
for there to be like one encyclopedia and one glossary is super valuable, because then it gives the casual fan a chance to kind of break into that and start sounding more like an egghead or a stat head, which I am not clear on the difference between.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a. We'll have to create a website that details all the difference between stat heads and eggheads.
Egghead versus stathead.com.
Yeah, it's a very simple website. Yeah, and actually, one thing I want to bring up is I've been doing a lot of wide receiver athleticism scores, combining it with wide receiver production scores, producing hits and misses. There's a piece up that I have on coldomaha.com about receivers who, in this system, scored well, did not score well. One interesting thing is that I've been talking to people about some of the misses in the system. So, wide receivers like Will Fuller are not well accounted for in the system. And so this is going to be an interesting question that comes up when we talk about Will Fuller's athleticism. Everyone knows he's fast, but he's also like 180 pounds. And there's a bunch of small receivers that are fast, that have done really well, that have scored poorly in my system. T.Y. Hilton, John Brown, Emmanuel Sanders, sort of. He's not as fast as some of these other guys. Deshaun Jackson and Mike Wallace. Those four plus kind of Emmanuel Sanders, kind of Antonio Brown, although I wouldn't call him fast. I would just call him I guess he wasn't athletic. Small receivers who are fast are maybe their own subset of receiver that my system currently does not take into account. Mike Fuller is in that category, but the problem is there's a bunch of receivers in that category. Ted Ginn, Darius Hayward-Bay, Troy Williamson. We know that they're misses, right? And so you kind of have to figure out which one Will Fuller is. And, who knows? I'll probably take a deeper look at that, but that's something that we also want to take a look at when we design systems, is there a category of players, like you mentioned, like we talked about with Vontez Burfict versus like Scooby Wright and Matakevich, and maybe Vincent Ray and Ray Maluga, other Cincinnati Bengals linebackers, maybe they're in that category too. Maybe Paul Dawson is in that category too. We don't know if he is, because we don't know if he's good yet. But the Bengals drafted him too. So maybe they see something in really slow, high-tackle linebackers. But yeah, maybe there's a prototype out there that we haven't taken into account when we design the system. Maybe, I think John's system, for example, is phenomenal. And I think that one of the things it doesn't take into account is teammate quality, which we can get a rough approximation of when we do, draft expectation of teammates, right? But maybe it doesn't take into account, pro-style systems. Like maybe it doesn't take into account Georgia Techie systems, which actually does a really good job of taking into account that system. But maybe there's an offensive scheme that it doesn't take into account. Right now, it seems to take into account basically every offensive scheme. But if we take a closer look at some of these misses, maybe not. Maybe if your quarterback is too good, your wide receiver market share falls down. Right? We talk a lot about how bad quarterbacks hurt wide receiver, production. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's good quarterbacks. Who knows? So, there's always things that we want to correct and always things we want to take a look at and always things that we want to, if we can classify our misses, we should strive to.
Well, exactly. And that's why it helps to have a community of good thinkers who are interested in asking these difficult questions so that people who are egg/stat heads can further refine their systems and maybe have fewer misses in the future.
Hopefully, if we should always want to be better at getting knowledge and stuff like that.
That's the point, right? That's what we're doing all this for.
In theory, really, it's just congratulating ourselves about knowing stuff. So,
hooray! All right, so that was intense. Shall we end with something funny and tabloid-esque?
Absolutely.
All right. So Johnny Manziel famously commandeered a TMZ videographer's camera for a second in order to claim that he was living with Denver Broncos linebacker Von Miller. It's like, oh yeah, we're bros. I totally live with the guy.
That was interesting.
Johnny Football. Von Miller took to Twitter to deny the allegation, as any intelligent person would.
Amicably deny it, because he's a huge fan of Johnny.
Well, they went to college together. Like, they're bros.
Yeah.
You can't throw your buddy under the bus, but if you want to be, like, you just took the franchise tag for the Denver Broncos, you need to stay far away from the hot radioactive mess that is Johnny Manziel.
You'd think that, but he also has openly advocated that the Broncos sign him.
Well, he can advocate for that while also knowing that the Broncos will never sign him in a million years and not look like an idiot and actually end up looking like a good guy as a result. So yesterday...
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. So yesterday...
news comes out that Josh Gordon failed another drug test. Either it was dilute or it was positive. Either way, it wasn't good. Today, news comes out that Josh Gordon will not be reinstated. He was not, in fact, on a suspension. He had been kicked out with the promise that he might be able to come back if he straightens up and flies right.
Right. This is, by the way, not a non sequitur.
It is not a non sequitur because it turns out Johnny Manziel's roommate was Josh Gordon. And not
what? So, a couple questions. How did Johnny Manziel confuse Josh Gordon with Von Miller?
That is an interesting question. I have no thoughts.
Second question. Why did agent of both Josh Gordon and Johnny Manziel, Drew Rosenhaus, allow them to live in the same house?
That is a compelling question. How much time was Drew spending at that house? What was he doing there? Those are some Skip Bayless questions. Actually, no, those are more Nancy Grace than Skip Bayless. Third
question. Both Josh Gordon and Johnny Manziel seem to be unfamiliar with the perception that teams have. And maybe we're wrong. Maybe teams do not share our perceptions that teams have, but they rather agree with Johnny and Josh. But it seems unlikely given that Johnny is still not on the team. They both seem to be unfamiliar with the perceptions that teams have about the way that they should behave. And I feel very uncomfortable saying the way that they should behave because it feels very paternalistic and I don't like telling people how to live. But Johnny, in that TMZ, you could call it an interview, but he did just kind of take the camera. Johnny Manziel said, NFL teams don't care if I party, bro. There's a difference between partying and being out of control, bro. Which
this ESPN article, which we will link to in the show notes, is amazing because the word bro is in so many of Manziel's quotes.
Yeah. So while I think he's correct, technically, that there's a huge difference between partying and being out of control, and that many NFL players party. But
I don't think that was ever the issue with Johnny Manziel.
You're right. If you're Johnny Manziel, do nothing to further the perception that you are trying to turn your life around. And that for Johnny, typically, where there's been partying, there's been out of controlness. And maybe if he's near parties, he is very much likely to be out of control. And then maybe he shouldn't party, at the very least, to show a commitment to being, if he wants to play in the NFL, maybe he doesn't. He's independently wealthy, so fine. But if he wants to be in the NFL, like, he might have to give up something that he likes, which is partying, even if he's 100% correct, which he's not. Even if he's 100% correct that if he continues to party, he will not do stuff that's out of control.
Well, Manziel,
like,
in his own
players,
words,
and like maybe Johnny has like a problem that like needs, he needs help and stuff like that. So I don't want to be like, you're dumb and stupid and you should feel bad. But he's wrong.
Well, Manziel, in his own words, says, anywhere I get picked up, bro, is a blessing. Whatever happens, I love ball. I want to play. And
bro.
He did not. He specifically did not say bro this time. I feel like if he had said bro, the writer would have included it because the writer
that's true.
have an issue.
Given how willing the writer was to include
all the bro
previous iterations of bro.
But the quote about, I don't think there's anything wrong with partying, bro. I think there's a difference between partying and being out of control. I think the whole issue with Johnny Manziel this entire time that culminated in the Vegas drag experience was that maybe Johnny Manziel is not the best judge of the difference between partying and being out of control.
That's also true. So, like, one, he's probably wrong about the NFL not caring about him specifically partying. But two, maybe you can't tell the difference between partying and being out of control. That's a good point.
Well, and I think that's the concern at the end of the day that teams have, is that, he is not aware of, the repercussions of his actions. He doesn't think he's doing anything wrong, and consequently, he will be a tabloid nightmare for whatever team takes him on. The Browns tried, and look how well that ended for them. And Manziel seems like studiously unaware that, all like these actions are actually being watched. Like, I don't know. I don't want to claim that I, am inside his head or anything, but I get the sense that he just is not willing to acknowledge that when he leaves the stadium or when he leaves the weight room, when he leaves the locker room, that the team is still watching him and that the stuff that he does still reflects on the team. I don't know that he is clearly making that connection. And I know that's an easy thing to think, and it's not, it's not a belief that is limited only to professional football players. There are lots of people who like to get together and make bad decisions together and reinforce each other's beliefs over, the value of the decisions they're making. And, maybe they're not, categorically bad decisions. Maybe they're just, decisions that, some reasonable people would disagree with. But I got to tell you, Johnny Manziel and Josh Gordon are two people who are probably the most oblivious to all the institutional pressure that they should be feeling to keep them in this job that everybody wants and almost nobody can have.
Yeah, no, for sure. And okay, so this is actually another interesting thing that's been kind of brought up. Related to all of this is the idea that, let's go back to Josh Gordon for a second, the idea that Josh Gordon is wasting his talent. It seems like he wants to be in the NFL. So to him, he may actually be actively hurting his goals. But a really good point, and there's actually a really good story by Adam Harstad, someone I follow on Twitter, about the concept of wasting one's talent. It's his talent, and if he chooses not to play football, then he chooses not to play football. And that it's kind of weird how often, people are angry at people for quote unquote wasting their talent.
That is a communist thing to think. I am not even joking. We don't go to school. We're not told that we will be funneled into the job that we will be best at. We are told that we can do whatever we want. Whether or not that's true is a different story. But we are not, schooled with this idea.
It is an ideal that we ostensibly hold in society. We can do whatever we want. And
we're not like measured for our specific talents and then fit into boxes. That's what we would do if we were communists.
Right.
And so the idea that, this guy is like wasting his talent and that's some sort of crime against the rest of us is, a little misguided. I think you're exactly right. It's his talent. If he wants to use his other talents to, make money or do whatever, then he can do that, just not in the NFL.
Right. And so that's like, so that I think is another thing that people need to pay attention to. Now, it seems like he wants to play in the NFL, right? Based off of what we know, and he's applied for reinstatement, obviously. I believe his application was denied today. Yeah, it was just denied.
Yeah.
Today. Yeah, as of this recording. So, but what's interesting is that he has been tested very frequently and randomly over the course of 15 months and didn't have a negative test until very recently. The negative test is interesting because he failed because either, and the stories have not been very clear about this, either because the sample was too diluted or because he tested positive for a dilutant in the sample. I don't know, and I'm probably going to have to look up a story to see which one of these is true.
It's okay. I've already done it for you.
Fantastic.
Quoting an ESPN.com article, Fox Sports, which first reported the news, cited a source informed of the test results, so some guy, that Gordon's sample was positive for marijuana and dilute. Both Gordon's...
So is it a banned substance that dilutes urine?
Well, both Gordon's A and B samples were positive for marijuana and dilute. According to the report, the level of marijuana in the wide receiver's system was below the 35 nanogram threshold, but the diluted sample is the same as a positive test by the NFL standards. Usually... Right,
and the reason he failed is because it was diluted.
Well, and so...
Not because of the marijuana in the sample.
The way they... I don't know if this is true for the NFL, but historically the way they would determine if drug tests were dilute is they would measure the levels of trace chemicals that are commonly present in urine. And if they were found to be below a commonly accepted threshold, then the sample is considered dilute. And you can get there a lot of different ways, and you can try to cheat it a lot of different ways. Some people would take doses of creatine, because creatine is one of the byproducts in urine that they measure to see if your sample is considered diluted. So it is entirely possible that Josh Gordon had a much higher level of THC in his system, but drank like 2 gallons of water in the 18 hours before the test. And so while there was, a very small detectable amount of marijuana in his system, there was also too small an amount of these urine adjuncts or whatever. So that's possible that it was just like a naturally dilute sample, or he might have just poured some water in the cup.
Right. Which that's always funny to me.
Which if he did that, come on, man. But that's, we're talking about the roommate of a guy who dressed in drag to go party in Vegas thinking that nobody would notice.
My name is Billy. And so what's interesting is that the NFL can't, or not the NFL, but generally speaking, most organizations cannot say that kind of test failure is testing positive for the drug, even though there were levels. And what's interesting is that in the story, and I don't think there's been any additional reporting on the story. So all we have is this Fox News report. We don't know if prorated the marijuana concentration to a more appropriate sample, whether or not that would pass the threshold, or whether or not that's an appropriate way to think about the marijuana concentration in a diluted sample. So we don't know if actually Josh Gordon had another issue with marijuana getting past the point of testing positive in a sample, or if it was like a situation that had occurred previously with Josh Gordon, which is that his sample tested positive for marijuana but for an arbitrarily stringent or insanely stringent standard for what is considered a positive test for marijuana, one that most organizations, almost every organization that tests for marijuana doesn't use, right? I think it was something like 25 nanograms, and generally speaking, a lot of organizations are at 60. The NFL moved it up to 35 as a compromise with the NFLPA or something like that. And so it was possible for you to test positive for secondhand smoke or something like that. We don't know if it's that situation where having any marijuana in both A and B samples in a diluted sample count or not. So it's kind of weird to say this is an example of Josh Gordon throwing his life away or something like that, because we don't even know the nature of the failed test.
That's a silly thing to say.
Well, football is life, so football is your alpha and omega. That's the only important thing.
And if you have talent, you should never waste it.
Right. One side note, though, of course, things do change when contracts exist, and he did sign a contract with the Browns, and so there's some reasonable expectation for you to say, hey, not fulfilling your contract with the Browns. But NFL contracts, because they're generally not guaranteed except when it comes to signing bonuses, are two-way, right? Players can quit whenever they want. NFL teams can cut them whenever they want. The only difference is that when a player quits, the NFL teams can often go to arbitration for the rest of a signing bonus. And if an NFL team cuts them, the team is obligated to pay the rest of the signing bonus. So that is a difference. But for the most part, I think the idea that he signed a contract is relevant, but not as important as I think a lot of the moral outrage that surrounds players who quote unquote waste their talent.
I am not convinced of the moral outrage aspects of this story yet, for all the reasons you enumerated. Just that this is, and the NFL's drug testing policy could use some common sense refinement, I guess. But I don't know. At the end of the day, if you want to play in the NFL, it is not just about playing football. There is a public perception game that you have to play and play well. Like if you quit an NFL team, then that's fine. You can forfeit the money if you decide you don't need it. But if you decide you want to play football again, the desire to play, believe it or not, is a highly valued trait among coaches. And
yeah, crazy.
Astonishing, right? And so they'll be less likely. Like, look at all the difficulty Keyshawn Johnson had trying to get back into the league after he quit.
Right.
Like, that's fine. If you want to go smoke weed, then go ahead and do it. But you are probably burning some bridges, not only with the team you're leaving, but with future teams that might want to hire you. Whereas if you get cut by an NFL team, I guarantee you there's at least 2 coaches and at least 2 analysts for other teams that secretly think that you're the dark horse, wild card, secret find of the offseason, and will give you a chance and give you at least some money to play football, which you ostensibly love to do.
Right. So that's what was interesting about. Really, we're just rehashing the lessons that exist in the Ricky Williams 30 for 30, Run Ricky Run. Which is basically all about a super talented player who really just didn't feel like playing football.
Do you think that Manziel and Gordon watch that together? Like they just pass a blunt back and forth and watch the Ricky Williams?
I think they invite Ricky. Like, hey, we're all Texas bros. Let's watch. Because then you've got a whole weed smoking Southwest conference, right? Because you've got Texas, you've got Baylor, and you've got Texas A&M. They're all just watching Run Ricky Run, be like, oh, that's you, man. Yeah, it's me.
God, what a circle jerk. Everyone's just so proud of how talented they are.
Right? How talented and irrelevant that is.
Well, and at the end of the day, Johnny Manziel is telling, he's like, I just love the game, I just want to play ball. Well, you don't have to be in the NFL to play football. You just have to be in a park with a football.
That's true. Also, I bet the Arena League cares a lot less about all this stuff.
I imagine the Arena League might make him a sotto voce promise to not have this stuff in the news if he wanted to go out 6 nights in a row in West Hollywood while playing for the, what are they called? The LA Kiss?
Yeah, he could play for the LA Kiss. He could play, well, actually, I don't think the Iowa Barnstormers exist anymore, which is too bad. I believe that's where Kurt Warner started his career. But yeah, he could play for the LA Kiss or any number of other Arena Leagues. Arena League teams. I think Arizona has one. I know Blake Murphy, who I follow on Twitter, was a scouting intern for the Arizona Rattlers, I think. They're good. Former Viking, sort of Viking, kind of. He was invited to camp. Leon Mackey was an Arizona Rattler. Led the league in sacks in the playoffs. So yeah, there's all sorts of Arena League teams. There's an indoor football league. The Green Bay Blizzard, for example, have a team. They pay you in food instead of money. But Johnny Manziel's independently wealthy. Who cares?
Are you allowed to take pictures of the food?
Probably.
Is it worth taking pictures of? Is it good food?
Am I missing? Is there a joke I'm missing here?
No, that is the joke. You're just not laughing at it, which I don't know if that counts as missing it.
Well, so I interviewed, actually, it was Leon Mackey again, actually, who was in the indoor football league. the food that they paid him was frozen chicken breasts and bread, and then also $20 plus free board.
They fed him frozen. They wouldn't even cook his chicken breast for him.
No, they paid him in frozen. It didn't feed. It wasn't like, this is the cafeteria. Here's some frozen chicken breasts. They're like, take this home, put it in your freezer. This is part of your salary.
Oh no.
Plus bread.
Was it Wonder Bread?
It is unskinned chicken breast, by the way.
Oh, okay. That's actually better. Unskinned. Hopefully, it was unskinned chicken breast and sourdough bread.
It was probably not sourdough bread. I bet it was white bread. It's Green Bay.
Only the finest nutrient-enhanced Wonder Bread. It's made from batter, not dough, which we're telling you is better.
Yeah, that was always a weird... There's a really good documentary that covers this. I mean, the documentary has all sorts of facts that are wrong, but find it on Netflix. I think it's episode 4 of Michael Pollan's food show on Netflix.
Yeah, Cooked.
Yeah, it's about as preachy as you'd expect, but there's a bit on bread. I think it's the episode called Air, because there's air inside of bread.
Well, there used to be. Well, no, actually, no, there is more now, or less, right, depending on which era's Wonder Bread ads you believe.
I think we've gotten a little off topic. Anyway, you get paid in bread and chicken and $20 and free board. So Johnny, play for the Green Bay Blizzard, get some chicken.
Do you love chicken as much as you love partying? That's the real question. Because
I suppose he wouldn't play for the Green Bay Blizzard. He'd have to find a team that was close to a city.
Well, I mean, the CFL isn't good enough for Tim Tebow, but it might be good enough for Johnny Football.
Games on Saturday or whenever it is. It's like I live in Houston, but I fly to Green Bay for games.
That'd be horrible. Ugh. Ugh. How would anyone ever want to fly to Green Bay? Unless it was to deliver a beatdown to the Packers.
And the Vikings don't even fly to do that. They bus. Go to the Appleton, Wisconsin hotels.
Wow.
CFL tough. Actually would be very difficult for Johnny, not because of its style of play, although a little bit because it is a very passing-oriented league, but because they only allow you to have like 6 American players on your roster.
So they're not allowed by fiat to become the NFL D League?
Right. Well, that plus the rules, but yeah, that's mostly it. Like, there's a talent cap, and you can't just import a bunch of American players for your team, which I think that's great. I think that's a good rule. But it does limit the opportunities for players who... And the way they define Canadian, I think, is very close to what defines a Canadian citizen, except you don't have to be a Canadian citizen. So if your parents are Canadian, if you attended a Canadian school, so that you don't have to be a Canadian citizen to attend a Canadian school, obviously. If you attended a Canadian school and played football there, if you are Canadian by citizenship, or if you are Canadian by birthright, even if you're an American citizen and claim citizenship and not dual citizenship, you do not count towards the foreign cap rules. So, for example, there's a couple of prospects in this draft and every draft for players who are American citizens but are highly valued potential CFL draft picks because they do not count against the roster cap. Wait,
so you're telling me that I just have to get like an associate's degree from an online Canadian school? And
I think you have to play football in that Canadian school.
But if I did that and I brushed up on my French, I could be in the CFL?
There's a lot of Canadians that don't speak French, so you don't even have to do that.
Well, but I know that's like a huge bonus on your citizenship test. Like if you're a foreigner trying to, if there's like a point system. Not that I've looked this up before in advance of any oncoming political catastrophe, but there's a point system that takes into account your personal history, like you were saying, your parents' history, if you've lived in Canada. If you speak French, it turns out if you're a francophone, then that's a huge bonus.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that makes some sense. Canada's a lot less culturally French than I think a lot of people believe.
Well, but my suspicion is that's just a rule that the Quebecois shoehorned in. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. We both just came to the same conclusion.
Well,
But yeah, no, I don't think that you could play in the CFL because I bet you're not good enough at football. But the other parts, yeah, totally.
You just tell me about a talent cap. Don't they want like actively bad players?
There are a lot of they're not trying to get bad players, Dusty.
Well, they don't want good ones. Tell me what they want.
They want ones that are better than you.
They don't want a 34-year-old with a questionable knee.
I didn't say that. They don't want you, a 34-year-old with a questionable knee.
Well,
there's definitely 34-year-olds with questionable knees in that league. I'm just saying that they are probably better at football than you are.
Well, laissez les bons temps roulants, then.
I bet that was awful, but it's more impressive than me, so good job.
Let the good times roll. They say it in New Orleans a lot. That's the only reason I know it.
Oh, so it may
I would not
be
have
French,
passed the Francophone
French-ish.
test. Yes.
Do we have anything else on our sort of dossier of things that we want to talk about for this podcast?
Let me just check the old Twitter. Swami Dusty predicts no. And is correct.
All right. So that's a podcast.
Not just any podcast, an amazing podcast with phenomenal guest, Jon Moore. Follow him at the CFX on Twitter. He's got a great Twitter account. Writes a lot of great stuff at rotoviz.com, hosts Rotoviz Radio every week, gets some pretty baller guests as well.
Yeah, no, Rotoviz Radio is great. I listened to the Matt Harmon episode. I listened to, I think it was a Matt Waldman episode as well about Kenneth Dixon, running back at Louisiana Tech. Both great. The podcast overall is really great. I listened to it a lot during the football season for DFS advice.
Yeah, really great for DFS and just fantasy advice in general. They're high on production, it turns out.
Yeah,
so
they want players who have shown evidence of being good.
So if you're into that, then be sure to check that out. Arif can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I'm at Dusty O'Connell. At Norse Code DN is the Twitter account to follow if you would like to be aware of our bat signals. You know, I talked at the top of the show about how much I love our community, and not just for giving us money. You know, you make this show fun. And I was actually, I was chatting with Adam Carlson last night of Purple People podcast.
Yeah.
And he admitted to a small bit of jealousy with the kind of like listener engagement we get. And then he revealed to me that they do like Google Hangouts on air. They just like invite listeners to like be on the show. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, the prospect of that, you know, I love you guys, but that terrified me.
It's definitely, well,
I was like, you don't have anyone to screen your calls? Like what happens when somebody says something weird? Like what? I don't know.
we all just laugh awkwardly and then kick them off the show. I love, because I think that what a lot of our listeners have done is that they've like picked up on the ethos of the show and they've run with it. There's like a fair bit of irreverence, which is super nice, and the listeners get that. And then there's also like a lot of outside the box and critical thinking, and then there's also just like testing ideas and stuff. Like outside the box is like a buzzword that people use maybe a little bit too much, but like testing ideas and throwing new ideas out there is definitely within the ethos of the podcast, and our listeners definitely do that.
Well, and when we're getting into like the heavy duty analytics, I mean, it's important to remind people that we don't take ourselves too seriously. And I think we are very good at that.
Hopefully.
Well, if you feel like we're good at it, then flip us a couple bucks, paypal.me/NorseCode, or become a recurring contributing member at patreon.com/NorseCode and help Arif buy the 3 draft guides on the internet that were available that he did not purchase. Have you gotten any of the physical ones in the mail yet?
Yes, I've received the Nolan Naraki one, which includes actually a bunch of very useful inside information about what NFL scouts think about particular players.
Yeah, that's like the money guide, right? Like,
yeah. Tweeted out some of that. I've not received any of the other physical guides, except, well, we did get one. It was a new one for this year. We're probably not going to get it again. It was all right. But For now, the electronic ones I've obviously, gotten a hold of. Matt Waldman RSP, obviously always great. I have NDT Scouting from Kyle Krabs, I think is his name, at NDT Scouting. It's a great draft guide. I've taken a look at the Pro Football Focus draft guide. It's the first one they've ever put out. It's got a lot of good information, a lot of unique statistics and stuff like that. I've looked at some of the other ones. I took a brief glance at Frank Coyle's draft guide. He claims to be this huge insider. He broke a lot of news last year about, which quarterbacks NFL evaluators preferred. So I took a look at his draft guide. Good information, kind of poorly organized and surprisingly expensive. But that's kind of it. So I'll probably do a more comprehensive review of the individual draft guides on another show when I have the chance to look at all of them. But I've been able to look at some of them, and I can recommend the ones that I've already recommended. I think the Pro Football Focus one is good, but it's probably not as good right now as the NDT Scouting one or as Matt Waldman's, even though Matt Waldman's is only about skill players. And that's just because they're probably just getting their feet wet in terms of providing draft guides. A lot of unique data that no other draft guide has, and if you're willing to pay for that, and it's pretty cheap for a Pro Football Focus product, it's worth getting. But I would definitely recommend. I'd definitely be willing to break down and look at draft guides and stuff like that in the near future too.
Well, and the best thing about donating to Norse Code and then seeing that money go out to the guys who put in the time to make these draft guides is, John talked at the top of the show about how we put in more work than we would ever let on, which is finely crafted half-truth. But these guys that write the draft guides, reading the Waldman guide, this is a heroic task of information aggregation just to make this one guide. And Homeboy doesn't ask for much money for it. And so...
Yeah, and a lot of the money gets donated to charity. I already forgot the name of the charity, like Children of Light or something like that. I think it deals with violence in the home. So he doesn't even keep all of the modest amount of money that he asked for this amazing guide.
Even better. And the point is neither do we. Your Norse Code donation goes to keeping this football community creating this great content and bringing more awesome guests like John and Sigmund and, the parade of people we've had on the show lately. It keeps the whole football ecosystem alive. So thank you all for your contributions, and please feel free to make more. Check out the show on dailynorseman.com. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/dailynorseman. And I think that's about it as far as the old plugs go. Is there anything you would like to plug before we call it a day?
By the time this episode publishes, I'll probably have a Laquon Treadwell scouting report, more subjective than analytical, up, and we could probably pair that with what you heard from John today on the podcast.
Boom. Done. This has been this week's episode of Norse Code. Our formula is this: keep Teddy alive. And we will see you next week.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this: we go out, we hit people in the mouth.